All right. Not sure we could have fit any more people up here. Good evening and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and we are truly quite excited to be hosting Josh Dawsey, Tyler Pager, and Isaac Arnsdorf, who are here to talk about their new book, 2024, How Trump Retook the White House and the Democrats Lost America. There's a lot of journalistic firepower in this group, as you could see. These three authors are excellent journalists who were very immersed in political coverage during the last presidential election and have gone back to reconstruct in even finer detail exactly how Trump staged a remarkable political comeback and won, how Biden for too long brushed off concerns about his age and declining poll numbers before withdrawing, and how Harris, despite a valiant effort after entering late in the race, lost. As Josh, Tyler, and Isaac say in the introduction to their book, there's a view popular among some that this election was over before it started, insofar as many voters already thought the country was on the wrong track and they were inclined to vote against whoever the Democratic candidate was. But that's not how Josh, Tyler, and Isaac saw it. In their view, the outcome wasn't so predetermined. Instead, they assert the election hinged on accidents and individual decisions and might just as easily have gone the other way. They make this case compellingly in their very thorough and authoritative book. Now, many of you may be feeling like the person who reviewed the book in the New York Times, not terribly eager to relive the fateful twists and turns of the 2024 election, given that it did lead to our dismal present, although judging by this crowd tonight, I guess a lot of you do want to relive 2024. But anyway, as the reviewer added, it's hardly the fault of these authors the way the election turned out. The fact is, in its comprehensiveness, its extensive sourcing, and its abundant behind-the-scenes detail, this book goes quite a long way toward filling in the public record of what went right and what went wrong in what indisputably was an extremely consequential election, the effects of which, of course, we're likely to be dealing with for a very long time. Now, Josh, Tyler, and Isaac were all reporting for the Washington Post during the election, but two of them have since moved to other publications. Josh, you want to raise your hand? Josh is now at the Wall Street Journal as an investigative reporter focused on politics. Tyler, you want to raise your hand? Now covers the White House for the New York Times. Isaac remains at the Washington Post, although he is on parental leave. But he's at the Post on the White House beat when he comes back. Now, guiding this evening's discussion will be another very experienced Washington political journalist, Ashley Parker, who spent 8 years. She spent 8 years also at the Washington Post, overlapping with Josh, Tyler, and Isaac, and now is staff writer at The Atlantic. She also is political analyst for NBC and MSNBC, so she knows the authors well and certainly knows their subject firsthand as well. So please join me in welcoming Josh, Tyler, Isaac, and Ashley. Really cool.
So this is such a good book. So I was so flattered and humbled and honored and only slightly inconvenienced when they asked me to moderate. So I thought I would start with a point of personal privilege and make this about myself. And so when I write an article, if it has multiple bylines, the question my mom, but other people ask me most frequently is like, how does it work? Who did what? How did you put this together behind the scenes? And I know how that works with an article, but a book is a totally different animal. So in my fan fiction version of you guys, the three of you are like sitting at a computer together, like very industrious hamsters. But I figured I would ask, how did you guys actually, the three of you, put this book together, and did different people do different things, and how did that collaboration work?
There actually was a lot of that.
Yeah.
I can take a stab at that. So one of the great things about the Washington Post, as all four of us work there, is the collaboration and collegiality. As you know well, we all sort of sat near each other. And I was covering the White House, and Isaac and Josh were covering the Republican nomination, mostly Donald Trump. And we knew that this was going to be a historic and consequential election, and we were uniquely situated to tell that story. And so a lot of the reporting was sort of divvied up that way. I mainly focused on Democrats, and they mainly focused on Republicans. And we, if you read the book, you'll see there are some chapters that are clearly Democratic chapters and chapters that are clearly Republican chapters. But we did a lot of collaboration together. So someone would take a first stab at writing something, we would exchange drafts. We did it all in Google Docs. We spent 3 days at the Eastern Shore. A generous friend let us use their house for a little writing retreat and finished basically the book in those few days there. But it was a super collaborative process. I mean, we spoke to more than 350 people, and you just can't do that alone on this timetable. And our goal was to tell the comprehensive and definitive story of this election. And there were 3 candidates at the end of the day. And so we brought all the sort of reporting firepower that we could to tell that story.
I think that's a good answer.
And it is a good answer. And the book opens essentially with a scene of Josh down at Mar-a-Lago interviewing Donald Trump, and it ends with a similarly remarkable scene of Tyler procuring Biden's phone number and calling him. So I wanted to start with you, Josh. Can you just take us inside a little bit? What it's, for those of us who have not had the pleasure of being down at Mar-a-Lago, what that experience was like?
Yeah, I was there about 10 days before the inauguration, and his club was just teeming with, sycophants, would-be ambassadors, people who wanted jobs, people who wanted favors, this inexplicable Congresswoman Lauren Boebert carrying a shimmering gold dress on a rack. I still don't know why she was doing that. People trading cigars in the lobby. It's just a motley crew of people at Mar-a-Lago, right? And I'm sitting there on the sofa waiting for Trump to do his interview. He's running late, which he's always running late. They sort of joke that it's Trump time, but he has all these people coming up to him and courting him. And he sees me and he comes over and he's like, "Josh, you're not going to believe this." I'm like, "What?" He goes, "Mark Zuckerberg's in there." And you can tell he's thrilled, right? He has Mark Zuckerberg here, kissing his ring. And then he goes and talks to Zuckerberg. Sure enough, Zuckerberg was in there. And then in the middle of the interview, I'm sitting talking to him about all sorts of things. And Elon Musk just walks into the room, just saunters into the room. And Trump sort of realizes, in that moment, that, this is wild. Zuckerberg's here, Elon Musk is here. And he turns to me and he's like, if I wouldn't have won, none of these people would be here. And he's like, I wouldn't be there either if I was him, right? And so we talked for a little bit. And one of the more interesting things he said to me in that interview was, he said, if I wouldn't have gotten shot in July, do you think it would have been harder for me to win? I think it would have been a little bit harder. And he also said, he sort of put the stakes of the election as an existential one. He said, if I didn't win, the rest of my life was not going to be very pleasant. I was going to have a miserable life. And in sort of the 30 minutes talking to him, you could tell he realized he had leverage again, and he was coming back to wreak havoc.
So Josh got 30 minutes with Trump. Tyler got about 30 seconds. And I will say, no offense, I did not find those 30 seconds that you talked to him particularly revelatory, but what I did find so revelatory was A, how you were able to get his phone number, and B, how his aides responded to the fact that you called him in that conversation. So first, without revealing sources or methods, I'm kind of curious if you can share a little bit about how you got the phone call. Was it the phone number? Was it someone who sort of was frustrated and they felt Biden was too cocooned by his aides? Was it someone who, against conventional wisdom, thought Biden could really handle himself in a book interview and wanted to make sure he got to set the record straight? And then my second question is, can you just tell us a little bit about how Biden's team responded and what that told you about his operation?
Yeah, I worry sharing too much about exactly how I procured that phone number. But what was actually striking to me that I can give a little context to is that's a phone number he had for years. And I think a lot of people didn't realize that it worked. Unlike Donald Trump, who famously is now answering everyone's call. I see our former colleague Michael here, who's had many conversations with Donald Trump in recent weeks. Biden also similarly answers his phone when numbers calls. I've heard that for most of his presidency, the people that called that number were telemarketers. So it wasn't something that was really going around. And so, yes, I acquired it after the election. Somebody provided it to me. And that's about as far as I'll go. But in terms of the call, what was striking about it was I called and it rang and I just got his voicemail, which is just Joe. That's all it was. And I didn't leave a message because I figured if I left a message, it would just sort of be a problem. And then later that night, I'm at home. I'm with my fiance and we're cooking and my phone is connected to Bluetooth and the music interrupts and it says phone call from Joe Biden. And I was like, should answer that. So I answered and it was him and he was like, hello. And I introduced myself. I mean, he knew ostensibly who I was. I've been covering him for 6 years. And I said, I'm working on this book. We've interviewed Donald Trump. We think it's really important. You're a huge part of this story to talk for this book. And he said, I'm about to have dinner. Give me a call back tomorrow. As soon as I get off the phone with him, I get multiple calls and texts from Biden's aides. I didn't answer any of them. They had made it very clear. I'd been trying for months on every front to get an interview with Joe Biden. I did a series on him. I covered him. I traveled around the country and around the world. There was no doubt. So I figured if I called them back, I knew what the answer was. He was not going to talk to me. So I took his word and called him the next morning and he answered. I was sort of surprised. And he was getting on an Amtrak train, which is sort of just classic that I would reach him at that moment. And he answered 2 questions, and I agree, not very revelatory. At the time, it was sort of interesting when I shared it with Josh and Isaac because he had not spoken publicly at all. So it was, new that he was saying he didn't have regrets and he was criticizing Trump. And then he hung up because he had to go get on the Amtrak train. But he sort of suggested that we could be open to that conversation. His aides were not open to that conversation. They were quite aggressive in calling and texting and scolding me for calling him. And then they changed his number. So the number no longer works.
Sad. But in your book, one of the main arguments you make is that this election was in no way preordained. I personally sort of disagree with that assessment. I kind of always had the view that when you talk to voters, they fundamentally hated both choices, Biden and Trump, but Trump always had this very fervent MAGA base and enthusiasm that Biden didn't seem to have on the Democratic side. So I'm curious, you guys did 350 interviews, you have all this reporting. What makes you believe that? And can you also take us through some of the inflection points where you think things could have gone differently?
You're both looking to me for the hard question. Well, look, I mean, Trump might not have run at all. That's where we start the book. It's easy to forget now how low Trump was when he launched the campaign in the aftermath of the midterms, where the Republicans were supposed to have a red wave and instead had a face plan. And even before he could get to that point, leaving Washington in disgrace and in isolation. And there's kind of a makeover montage, like a boxing movie where Susie Wiles is going down to Mar-a-Lago to get him back into fighting shape. It's easy to forget now how weak and low Trump was. And even as he started to regain his stature in the party, he was telling people on the golf course and telling his friends that he wasn't sure he was going to go through with it. And it was the increasing threat of criminal prosecution and ultimately the search of Mar-a-Lago that tipped him over into that decision. So, I mean, that's the first one. And then, in the Republican primary, it was not a given that after the midterms that the party was going to stick with Trump. DeSantis had a chance. There was a lot more excitement about DeSantis on November 9th or 10th of 2022 than there was about Trump. Trump looked like old news. Trump looked like a loser. That did not have to turn out that way. Same thing on the Democratic side. We opened the book with all of the eager, ambitious next generation of Democratic candidates. Some of them are back campaigning in early states again this week, but they were ready, expecting the Democrats to do poorly in the midterm. They were ready to launch their campaigns, give Biden the old heave-ho, and say, you know, it's time to pass the torch. After the midterms went the other way, they all disappeared, and Biden's team used that to validate their position. No one's challenging him. Why wouldn't he run for re-election? So starting from, you know, there are a bunch more we can go through, but starting from there, like the rematch no one wanted very nearly didn't have to happen, and ultimately didn't either. I mean, no one, you know, I remember doing a story in the spring of 2024 when both tickets were basically locked. We interviewed all the people. I called back a bunch of people who answered the polls that they didn't believe that this was going to be the final ticket. And I was like, well, you know, you do know that they won. Like, this is going to be the ballot. And they would just say, no, it can't be. And actually, they were right.
Yeah. And so following on that, I mean, it sounds like you guys don't believe that Trump was inevitable to be the Republican nominee. But I am curious, speaking of pivot points, are there any moments that you think decisively won it for him? Or was it DeSantis being better on paper than he is in human flesh?
Well, I mean, one of the most interesting moments, right, is that Trump is charged with crimes in New York, and he is facing, you know, the prospect of being a felon. And the first thing the other Republicans do is all come out and defend him and say the charges are the rubbish. The charges aren't real. And when I talked to Trump at Mar-a-Lago, he said to me, like, I was surprised that they all came out and defended me so quickly, right? Because you know you're thinking him. Can you imagine he would ever defend, like, one of his opponents who had something thrown at them? Like, it wouldn't happen, right? And so I think that was a pivotal moment. I also think in the sort of summer there, none of the other candidates, because they couldn't find good lines of attack, were even challenging him. They basically were all saying, you know, he's great, Trump is great, we love Trump. What's the argument to be the nominee if you're actually like the other guy's good? Like, why would I vote for you, right? I mean, that was something we saw over and over in the book, was Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley and others trying to figure out how to criticize him, what to criticize him on, and really struggling with any line of attack that worked.
There was one attack that the Trump team was actually scared of, but never came. And that was when Trump criticized DeSantis for signing a 6-week abortion ban, which is identical to the policy that the governor of Iowa, very popular Republican governor of Iowa, had just signed. And there was polling from several of the campaigns that showed that was a bad mood for Trump in Iowa. And the Trump super PAC was bracing for that. They were getting their messaging ready. They were getting a counterattack ad ready. DeSantis never went for it because Haley was starting to rise after the first primary debate. And so he turned his attention to Haley instead of attacking Trump.
And Josh, you and I have covered Trump basically since he came down the golden escalator. And Isaac, you've covered him for quite some time as well. I'm curious, I mean, how was this campaign different from his previous ones? And do you believe the conventional wisdom that he was on the whole a much more disciplined and frankly better candidate this time?
I don't know that I would say much, but definitely more disciplined and better. I think the main difference was the people that he had around him. For the first time, really, he had a professional operation that, you know, an A-level Republican candidate would have around him. I mean, I think Susie Wiles, from my view in the reporting in the book, is the most important figure in Trump's return to power. And he had folks around him who were giving him, you know, advice that actually made sense politically, and they were convincing him to follow it. And we had never seen that before, right, with Trump. I mean, if you look at 2016, he had sort of a traveling band of misfit toys. I mean, some of them knew more than others, but they were fighting and jousting and leaking to the press. 2020, he and his campaign managers weren't even barely spoke at times. This time, he actually had a real cohesive team. And if you look at some of the things he was saying publicly and what his campaign was actually doing, there's a really interesting dissonance there, right? Trump says, okay, the election was stolen. You shouldn't vote in person. I mean, you should only vote in person. You shouldn't vote by mail. Republicans know they have to have people vote by mail and vote earlier. They're going to lose. So they cut ads and videos telling people to vote by mail and vote early, and they get him to sign off. right? You look at what he wants to talk about. The campaign does all of its polling and realizes the economy is the only issue that they're winning by double digits over the Democratic ticket. What do they spend all their money doing advertisements on? It's not what Trump is saying at rallies most of the time. A lot of the advertisement is about the economy. You look at how he did abortion, right? I actually brought this because I wanted to show it to you guys. Like, they gave him a presentation that said how a national abortion policy will cost Trump the election, right? They give us some on the point. And all it says is declaring any number of weeks would play directly into Joe Biden's hands on his simplest path to electoral victory. So they give him a pretty crass and calculated position, and then he takes it and sort of mitigates the abortion issue. What we saw in his conversations with donors, how he got tens and tens of millions of dollars from people, he was making pretty crass bargains with them behind the scenes, pretty, things that other Republicans would have done. Trump used to not be a very good fundraiser, believe it or not. So in a lot of ways, I think his operation was simply just better this time than before.
And if then we'll turn back to Biden. But one more Trump question for now. I mean, if I'm remembering correctly, this campaign, there were sort of two moments which felt major moments that felt a little fraught for him. One was in August when, among other things, Corey Lewandowski from season 1 made a season 3 cameo. And the other one I would say was probably near the very final stretch. I'd put it at like the Madison Square Garden rally up until Election Day. I remember following him around for 24 hours that final day. And Trump kept on saying aloud, mantra-like, as if trying to remind himself, this is ours to lose. So I'm curious, in those moments, Josh and Isaac, how did he pull himself back and right the ship of what could have gone in a very different direction?
Yeah, he really did almost blow it up in August, which was a combination of things. First of all, it was August. Like, who wants to work in August? But if you're Donald Trump and you're a rich guy in New York, you want to golf in August. He didn't want to campaign in August, so that was one thing. But seriously, he had a really hard time adapting to a new opponent. He felt like he won. He kept saying, it's not fair. I have to beat another candidate. Things he kept saying, it's not fair, and I have no respect for her. He couldn't get his head in the game to run against someone who he didn't respect how she got the nomination, and he didn't respect her personally. He had been hearing for years how everyone thought she was terrible. All of a sudden, she was the nominee, and all he was hearing about was how everyone was obsessed with her. He couldn't handle it, and that's why he turned against his own advisors. He blamed them for doing the early debate, and he had that Corey whispering in his ears, the let Trump be Trump guy, let's bring back the 2016 magic. And he really went very, very close to going for it. I think it was really the Harris debate that pulled him back from it. Like, he felt like he got his footing in that, even though I think, probably a lot of you watching thought that Harris won that debate. Trump felt like he got back to a place where he understood how he could run that campaign.
Yeah, I think all of the folks who worked for Trump viewed the end of July, sort of almost 1 year ago, coming up, and August as the worst months of the campaign by far, right? He's on stage at the National Association for Black Journalists event, questioning whether Kamala Harris is even black. He's screaming on his aides on the plane, I got ambushed. He's yelling at donors at various fundraisers, complaining they haven't given enough money. He's asking his friends on whether he should fire his staff or not. I mean, this was like vintage 2016 Trump that came back for a short period of time. We have a chapter in the book called A Cruel Summer. It's a throwback to a Taylor Swift lyric, if there's any Taylor Swift fans in here. But it was hot. It was miserable. He was not doing well. And it took a while to get out of it.
And Tyler, Isaac briefly mentioned this, but I do want to go back to Biden ending up running. In hindsight, there's been a lot of discussion about how no serious Democrat challenged him for the nomination. And I even remember at the Post, we were all calling around to figure out, is he going to run again? Is he not? And then suddenly the midterms happened and we just slid right into the general. But I'm curious, why didn't any Democrats challenge him? And also, what did his team do to try to make sure that didn't happen?
Yeah, there were a lot of Democrats preparing in ahead of the midterms to run. I mean, Phil Murphy, we opened chapter 2 with this scene of Phil Murphy, the governor of New Jersey, just recently reelected by a narrow margin, and he's sort of celebrating and saying, you know, if Biden runs, we'll support him, but if not, should I? Gavin Newsom's aides are preparing for him to sort of enter the race. J.B. Pritzker's traveling to New Hampshire. There's a lot of energy around these sort of governors that people see as the future of the party. And everyone expected the midterms to just be a bloodbath, and it wasn't. And a lot of Democrats attributed that to Roe v. Wade, feeling that there was backlash to Republicans trying to curtail abortion rights. Biden saw that as vindication of his strategy, which is ironic in some ways because abortion is the one issue that Biden was largely out of step with the rest of his party. It was not his comfortable issue. He would cut it out of speeches. He was supposed to say it in the State of the Union, and he just didn't say it. He is someone that has evolved on the issue, but was never the most fervent advocate for reproductive rights. And so it's sort of ironic that that's the way he read the midterm results. And so there was just sort of this energy that Biden sort of capitalized on of Democratic success. And then the Biden, White House officials decided that they could not just wait for him to announce. They needed to sort of tamp down on these ambitious Democrats. So they made 2 moves that are, pretty logistical and structural, but actually had real impact. The first is that they changed the primary calendar. So the traditional order of Iowa and New Hampshire going first, Joe Biden finished in 4th and 5th place in 2020 in those states, and he never did well in Iowa. And so they worried that if they kept that order, Biden would not do well and it would hurt his reelection campaign. There was a process already underway to change that order, and they just sort of overruled it and said South Carolina will go first, the state that resurrected his primary bid in 2020. And then they created this advisory board. It had no real impact besides being a messaging effort that they wanted everyone that could challenge Biden on their team. So they announced this list of like 30 ambitious Democrats, governors, senators, state lawmakers, and said they're all going to travel and support and be surrogates for the Biden campaign. And they just put everyone who would challenge Biden on it. And it was basically like, you're either in the tent or you're not in the tent. And they just made it really hard for anyone to maneuver outside of him.
So one more question for you. So Biden is the nominee until, of course, he isn't. But why, based on your reporting, after that disastrous debate, did it take him relatively so long to drop out?
Yeah, there's a multi-layered question there. The first thing to remember is that Joe Biden has an enormous chip on his shoulder. He feels he has long been, underestimated. He would say, I went to state school. I was the poorest member of the Senate. Barack Obama told him not to run in 2015. Barack Obama told him not to run in 2019. And the Democrats lost in 2016, and he could have won, and he won in 2020. So he long felt that the world was against him. Also, he's someone that has an immense amount of tragedy in his life. I'm sure a lot of you know the story of his first wife and daughter, his son, Beau. This was not seen as the calamity it would be seen to as most other people. We have a lot of reporting in the book about that weekend at Camp David after the debate, where a lot of the outside world thought it was a family crisis meeting. In fact, they were just coordinating their outfits for a family photo by Annie Leibovitz. So it wasn't this sort of insane, oh my God, the world is falling. It's another, challenge we'll get through. The other thing is he was really sheltered from the outside world. There's this scene in the book. I was actually on Air Force One that entire weekend, and it was this. We wrote a story together about that weekend, about this sort of bubble atmosphere where the world is melting down. The New York Times editorial board calls for him to drop out. Members of Congress are starting to freak out. And it's as if nothing went wrong. We're traveling to East Hampton. There's these big fundraisers. Behind closed doors, he's getting reamed out. But he's on Air Force One flying from New York to from New York City to East Hampton, and he asks his aides, how's it going? And they're like, it's all good, no big issue here. And someone overheard the conversation and was like, is this real life? The entire Democratic Party is melting down, and they're telling Joe Biden it's okay. And also, people couldn't reach him. Chris Coons, the senator from Delaware, a longtime ally of Joe Biden, could not get a hold of Joe Biden. His pollsters never got to brief him. Another thing we reported in the Washington Post that we build out in this book about this meeting where the pollsters are basically telling his senior advisors he can't win.
He doesn't have a path.
he doesn't have a path. And 2 days later, Steve Ricchetti calls one of the pollsters and says, your job is not to tell us we can't win. Your job is to tell us how we win. And they were like, well, the numbers say you can't.
Right. And then 16 days after that debate, Trump is at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, where everyone here knows what happens. Isaac was on the ground there with Trump. You wrote a fantastic first-person piece for the Washington Post at the time. But can you first briefly just kind of take us in what it was like to be on the ground quite close to an assassination attempt? And secondly, I'm curious, Josh and Isaac, how determinative or not politically do you think that assassination attempt proved for the campaign?
I think it was hard to tell at the time. I think in the longer term, it's become clearer. I mean, the most important immediate impact was that Elon Musk endorsed him, right? So, Musk was like a reluctant Trump supporter before. He was spending money to help him, but he didn't trust him. He wasn't giving Trump money. He was spending it in his own vehicle. And it wasn't until the assassination attempt that he became full-throated in supporting Trump. And I think that there were a lot of voters out there, too, who kind of thought like, it changed the way they thought of Trump, they thought that was enough with all the things that Trump had gone through, and they were impressed with how he handled it. Jeff Bezos was impressed with how he handled it. People who were not natural Trump allies were reaching out to express their admiration, and Trump loved that. The other thing that it did for those who were already in the camp, which you'll read more about in the Post in a few days. And I think there's a direct line between the assassination attempt and his inauguration speech, where he said, "I was saved by God to make America great again." For those of his supporters who believe in God, and there are many of them, Trump had always talked about God being on their side, but this looked like for both he and his supporters, the way that they talked about it changed as a direct intervention by God for them. And I think we're still seeing the effects of that. And then we should talk about the other effect was the operationally, the security.
Yeah. Whether or not it made a difference in the election, I don't know. But Elon Musk brought $275 million in. $275 million makes a difference.
And actually, just can I ask
in one
you
way.
one question about that? Not Elon, but I mean, you guys have one chapter, and like an entire chapter is basically devoted to that day in Butler, and it is kind of like a minute by minute behind the scenes account, which is incredibly gripping. And we in the public have all sort of seen the raised fist in that iconic moment, but I'm curious, covering him as long as you have, is there anything in that behind the scenes, that entire day, that jumps out at you?
The hospital.
That's a really good question. We did a lot.
Thanks, Josh.
Well, we did a lot of reporting in the book on the hospital and him being in the hospital there, right? And I think in that moment, he was pretty human, right? In a way, I think that we often don't see him. I think Trump basically creates a perception of all times. He wants to look tough in public. He's, sort of the guy, the swaggering guy. He wants people to be scared of him. He's trying to instill fear. But I think lying there in the hospital, he knew quickly that he was fine, or he was going to be fine at least. But I think there was a real, I'm not sure how long it lasted, but I think there was a real human element there that people probably will never see him show publicly.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, thinking about the image he was trying to project, thinking about he told you that they wanted him to take a stretcher into the hospital and he refused to do it because he didn't want the visual. So he was thinking about the image that he was projecting, even in that moment of human vulnerability.
And then it feels like the next major event is obviously Biden dropping out and Kamala Harris very quickly becoming the nominee. To be fair to her, she had 107 days to sort of do everything that a traditional campaign has 2 years to do. But Tyler, you covered her 2019 presidential bid. You covered this time around. I mean, I'm curious, are there things are there things you think she could have done or not done that could have potentially made a difference, or was some of this a fait accompli at that point?
Yeah, I think it's hard in terms of the counterfactual. I mean, one of the things that she clearly struggled with was how to deal with Joe Biden, and he made that harder for her. I think there's two really revealing moments. So we have the chapter in which she takes over is this sort of cinematic moment where she's making pancakes for her grandnieces at the vice presidential residence, and across the way in the pool house, her brother-in-law is having a private meeting with her top campaign officials, planning for if Joe Biden drops out. And someone's like, Brian Fallon is a communications director, says there's no way he's doing that tomorrow. And in the middle of that meeting, her son or her Tony West's son-in-law comes in and knocks on the door and says, Kamala needs you immediately. And it's Joe Biden calling her to drop out. But on that phone call, Biden says to her, I'm not going to endorse you right away. I'm going to wait a few days and drop out and then endorse you later. And she's like, you absolutely cannot do that. She's like, if you don't do that, other people are going to get in. And if then you do it a few days later, people are going to think you're just succumbing to pressure. Like, you can't have this window of opportunity. The next thing that he does is he calls her on the day of her debate with Donald Trump, ostensibly to wish her good luck. And he says, just so you know, I'm hearing from some friends, unclear who, that you're campaigning in a way that's disloyal to me. And you should be careful. He frames it as political advice. I'm very popular in Pennsylvania. Reader, he just was forced out of the presidential race for not being popular, but alas. And he says, you should be careful because I'm popular and you don't want to break from me. So he obviously made it difficult for her. That moment on The View that I'm sure everyone has seen where she says, I can't think of anything to disagree with. In the book, we report that's not the answer she was supposed to give. She had a prepared answer, so much so that her aides then tried to go to the View host during commercial break and say, can we try that again? That didn't happen. But she just really couldn't figure out how to do it. And the last thing I'll say on that is, the challenge was she had framed herself as his number two in such a way that she was in every meeting, she was there for every decision, which isn't totally true, but that was the public narrative. And so then it was hard to think about, well, what meeting were you in where you spoke up and disagreed? And so there just was an authenticity problem that they were going to run into had she broken with him, though I think in retrospect, a lot of people felt it would have been better to break with him than to try to keep up this facade because he just wasn't popular.
So I know everyone here is desperate to ask these guys questions. So I'm just going to ask each one of them one more question, and then you guys can head down to the mic to ask your questions. But first to you, Isaac. You've covered the MAGA base for a very long time. Right now, we're seeing some fascinating tensions with the base and the president, from disagreement over the Iran strikes to failure to continue the Jeffrey Epstein conspiracy theories. I'm curious, what do you make of this? And is there a world in which they ever turn on Trump, or the people who take the fall, like Pam Bondi and Republicans in the midterms?
Yeah, there is a magic way where everything turns out to be some advisor's fault and never Trump's fault. But I do find these moments, and there are a few of them from time to time, very interesting, where there's pushback with Trump within the movement. I mean, I think there's this misconception out there that whatever Trump says goes. If he wakes up tomorrow and says, actually we love free trade, everyone would suddenly be free trade again. And I don't think it works that way. I think moments like this on a key issue such as trade, immigration, there are a handful of others where there are these actual ideological commitments in the movement that if he strays too far from, there are these other moderators with some independent stature who are able to enforce some boundaries. This was kind of the original falling out with Musk, in a way, was over the visas. So, it's a feedback loop is the way that I've always thought about it. Like, he's testing out his audience, he's seeing what plays well with them. They're obviously listening. They're obviously listening to what he says and assimilating that information. So there's push and pull.
And Tyler, who do you think Joe Biden wants to be the next Democratic nominee, and why?
Can I say Joe Biden?
You cannot.
I think it's a great question, and I think the Democratic Party doesn't want him weighing in on that process at all. But I think one person that he really likes, and I think there was some regret in the Biden orbit that he did not pick her to be his vice presidential running mate is Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. I also think he has a bias toward Pennsylvania, so I could see him liking Josh Shapiro. He was very a lot of his aides, like the Mike Donlin types, worked for Conor Lamb, and so that sort of Democratic mold is someone that I could see Biden liking. But yeah, I would say those two, but that's just a total guess.
And Josh, basically, same question for you about Trump, with the added question of, do you think Trump has it in him to support someone other than himself to succeed himself, or is he going to want to see this play out Apprentice style?
Well, I mean, if you notice in his interviews so far, he has not. They've asked him to sort of pick J.D. Vance or say, "Do you support J.D. Vance?" And he says, "It's too soon. It's too soon." So he's not giving him that leverage yet. I mean, Trump looks at every situation, I think, as how do I have the most leverage over other people? How do I get the most money? How do I have the most leverage? So right now, what I think you're seeing him do, most presidents, after they win a second term, stop fundraising. Trump is like doing massive fundraisers with all of his donors for his PAC almost every weekend. He's raising hundreds of millions of dollars at his clubs, with lobbyists, with everyone. He wants to have a big bank account so he can control what's going on, right? And you look at the bill right now that just passed. It's not exactly popular, right? There are a lot of folks thinking that it could lead to doom for Republicans in the midterms. I guess we'll see. Politics are sort of ephemeral, and anyone who tells you they know now, I think, is wrong. But Trump will want money so he can control. He still will have power even if Republicans lose in the midterms. And we'll see what he does on an endorsement. I mean, I think it would be hard even for Donald Trump to sort of endorse someone other than a sitting vice president. Like, I don't really know how you do that, but he's done a lot of things before that other people haven't done. So we're not in the prediction business anymore.
And we have about 15 minutes left, so if people want to come in, there's a microphone right there to ask questions.
Hello. So I have a question. It's about before the midterms. There were 3 Democratic members of Congress that had said they didn't want Biden to run for re-election. There was Congresswoman Angie Craig, Congressman Tim Ryan, and of course, Congressman Dean Phillips, who challenged Biden for the Democratic nomination for president for 2024. They said he was a great president, but he just wouldn't win re-election. They didn't see any proof that that was going to happen. They wanted to change to a new generation, new ideas, because the country thought they were on the wrong track. And a competitive spirited primary would create the opportunity for a candidate to come along chosen by the voters that could beat Donald Trump again. And I wanted to know if, in your opinion, if more Democrats that agreed with them privately had spoken up and publicly said this, and maybe even held a secret ballot vote of no confidence to present to Biden in his campaign that hadn't happened yet, could that have led to a Democrat being in the White House right now?
It's a great question. I mean, I will say every poll you looked at, or almost every poll you looked at, the majority of Democrats didn't want Joe Biden to run again. So like general public voter, in part because they just didn't think he was actually going to do it. So I think in the hypothetical universe, if there was a huge amount of Democratic, criticism from people that Biden trusted potentially. I mean, one of the things that's remarkable in our reporting in the book is no one ever told Joe Biden don't run again. So like all of his aides and advisors, there was never a meeting, should I run, should I not? I mean, the opening line of one of the chapters is Joe Biden told his aides he was running until he told them he wasn't, and he never said he wasn't. And so I think what we saw, the reason he got out after the debate was because of that pressure, but it took a relentless amount of pressure. I mean, there was this meeting where nearly every single Democratic senator stood up and was like, he can't run. And then his aides didn't really tell him that. And then Chuck Schumer had to sit him down and be like, if we did a secret ballot in the Democratic caucus, you would maybe have 3 votes. So I think, sure, that could have worked, but it would have had to be a relentless pressure campaign. And the Democratic Party just doesn't really do that. I mean, we've seen that over the course of 2016. There's sort of this anointing factor that we've seen history play out over time. And Democrats have suffered electorally because of it.
Great, thank you.
Hello. I think over the last 10 years, suffice to say, the country's been
exposed to a lot of conspiracy theories, a lot of them mostly from the right side of the aisle. But in the last 12 months, on the left side of the aisle, I've had even personal friends and acquaintances have been really giving into the conspiracy theory that Trump was actually not shot a year ago and everything. And I've got friends trying to send me pictures of, look how his ear healed and everything. And I'm a historian. I'm trying to think, do you have any advice on trying to convince my left-wing friends and liberals that Trump was actually targeted in an assassination attempt?
Well, look, first of all, I love your shirt.
Thank you.
I expect that conspiracy theories about the Trump assassination attempt will end about 60 years after everyone stops wondering about the JFK assassination. But seriously, like, conspiracy theories happen when unimaginable, inexplicable things happen, right? It's hard to, 9/11 was another one. Like, when unimaginable things happen, it really challenges the logical mind to understand how that could be. And it opens people up in ways that they aren't ordinarily to alternative explanations. I was actually having this conversation with someone in an undisclosed green room yesterday who was asking, how could it be that there are just too many coincidences? How could it be that they allowed him to take the stage when they knew there was a suspicious person? And I told them that the reason was that the local police who were looking for the gunman and Trump's Secret Service detail were on different radio frequencies. That's why Trump's Secret Service detail never got word that they were looking for a suspicious person. So I do think that if you can provide information, that's the best answer.
Good luck.
Are there?
Oh,
So what's the most important lesson or two from the 2024 election for the Democrats, and what's an important lesson or two from the election for the Republicans?
For the Democrats, listen to your voters. I mean, there was just polling after polling that showed voters did not want Joe Biden to be the nominee. They didn't want a rematch, as Ashley was saying, but particularly for Democrats, it was sort of apparent that voters were not thrilled about Biden running again.
I'm not sure that you extract too many lessons from the book for the future of the Republican Party because no one is like Trump, right? The one thing that Trump did that I think is super interesting, though, and it does have some, importance for the future, is sort of remaking the coalition of folks who, voted for him. We have in the book, early in the campaign, his strategy team sort of sat down to think about how can we win. They crafted this memo and said, the main thing we need to do is go after men. We need to get male voters, right? Instead of spending our time trying to convince suburban women, trying to convince independents. And they really went after male voters in a lot of their strategy, and they won by large margins. They were going after low propensity voters, voters who don't always vote, voters who are hard to reach, voters who are sort of off the grid. They actually got a lot of those people. They got a lot of Black and Latino voters. I think people sort of mocked the Trump campaign when they said, oh, we're going to win Black and Latino voters. A lot of his critics said, oh, look at all the things he said over the years. There's no way he can win those voters. And they sort of targeted them and actually won them. At the same time, he lost parts of the electorate that maybe another Republican could win. So in some ways, he remade the coalition of who wins for the Republican Party with him. I think a lot of us, I see my dear friend Devlin Barrett there that we've talked about, and Devlin and I worked at the Post together, about how much of it is a male and female thing. I think Trump really understood the gender gap in this election, and his main strategy was to run up the votes with men. And if you look at the county by county results across the country and what happened, almost every county moved to the right. like counties that have not moved to the right ever before. And if you look at what happened with men and black voters and Latino voters, the numbers moved significantly towards him. Now, I don't know if another Republican can duplicate that. I don't know that how you exactly do it, but there were some lessons for the party, because if you look at after 2012, right, Mitt Romney, they did this historic autopsy. They say, oh, the Republican Party's, got all of these things to do. Trump sort of just flipped that on its head, right? He took a totally different calculus, and it sort of worked for him.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, one thing that's striking to me in hindsight is that the Democratic strategists always talked about the election as basically we've got 48%, they've got 48%, and it's trench warfare over that tiny bit of ground in the middle, like inch by inch by inch. And the way that Trump talked about it was, I'm going to win a supermajority. I'm going to win New York. And you laughed at that, but, he was shooting for the moon and came back to earth. I mean, guess which one of those approaches actually went over the top? Did he win a majority of black men? Of course not. But did he move the needle with black men? Yes. And so the way that he reimagined his coalition, the electorate, and ran a campaign that was true to him as the messenger with his message, that's what the Democrats don't know who their coalition is, they don't know what their message is, and they don't know who is their authentic messenger for that message. That's what they have to figure out.
Thanks. So the question that jumps out to me with this sort of slate of election books coming out by reporters is, and not you in particular, but what's your view of the role of the press over the last few years in terms of sort of the increasing maybe skepticism and view that maybe the press is somewhat biased and various media outlets we've always relied upon are not necessarily as trusted? I mean, do you think that's true? And do you think that the press, do you look back on the role of the press and think things could have been done differently? Folks mentioned Dean Phillips, and Dean Phillips had said that, he was sort of blacklisted from various press outlets, was no longer invited to appear on CNN, because he went against the party. It seems like the press gets a lot of mileage out of Donald Trump coverage, and I felt like you didn't see a lot of coverage in a number of outlets of potential alternative candidates in a way that was not completely skeptical, like Nikki Haley, Tim Scott, Ron DeSantis. Do you think that the press is sort of looking at things differently, and if they played the correct role, or if there's things that maybe should be done differently in the future?
Well,
It's a Michael question.
Well, I mean, there always could be things done differently, right? I think at the end of elections, as reporters, you always look back and say, like, what should we have written that we didn't write? What could we have done better? What were pivotal moments that we didn't quite see in real time that turned out to be pivotal? But I also think, for all the criticisms of the press, and there are lots of them, I've been writing about Trump for almost a decade now. People, if you read the newspapers, you read the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, you knew exactly what you were getting. I mean, I think his life, his career, his politics have been really exhaustively done. I mean, I hear people say, oh, if the press would have only done this, if the press only would have done that. I mean, we spent, Matea Gold, who's here, who was our boss, all of the Post, like we spent 40,000 words reconstructing everything that happened on January 6th, right? We did the most exhaustive package of the Post. We covered all of the criminal cases extraordinarily closely, right? We covered things he said in private, what he says behind closed doors to donors, his relationships with lobbyists, what his advisors are doing. I mean, other outlets were doing that as well, right? And so I don't subscribe to the theory that people did not understand exactly, unless you just choose not to read and choose not to watch, and past that, I don't really know what we can do. I think one of the things we tried to do for this book was, there were a lot of campaign books, a lot of them were good. What we wanted to do was rely on sort of, primary documents. We got, memos, we got recordings, we did a lot of interviews on the record. We were trying to write a book that was fear-minded and that people can read and say, here's what they have. They lay it all out pretty clearly. You can like the reporting, you can not like the reporting, but it's sort of, above, questioning a lot of it, right? And I hope that that's what people will take away. I'm sure folks will say, we were unfair to this person, or that the election could have been different if this would have happened, but I don't really know exactly what you can do about that. Does anyone else want to answer that? Okay, sorry. Did that sort of answer your question? I hope it did.
Yeah, I think so, sure. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Hello. I think so. My question is, who is the future candidate? One thing I remember with Obama when he came out was he had this speech like, "There's no blue America, there's no red America, there's one America." That really stuck in my head. And I feel like that's one time where we're very united and we're very low with the recession. In that sense, what is the rumor mill? Is there another Obama? Is there another underdog that can come out and convince everyone to unite? I tell my friends like he turned North Carolina blue. Like it's so wild that you need to feel like that was the last time I felt like the country really came together and was like, hey, we need to bring ourselves up. And it doesn't matter if you're whoever you are, wherever you came from, we are one. And so my question is, what is the rumor mill? Who is that person? Or is there an underdog that is out there that will come out?
Yeah, I think it's a good question in part because I think there's a divide in the Democratic Party about what the future is. Is it a candidate that speaks in the Obama-like way of uniting the country, or is it someone that is more partisan and more focused on like repelling Trump at every turn? And we're seeing that split. I just wrote a story about that with one of my colleagues about sort of the different approaches governors are taking. So someone like Gretchen Whitmer, who's in the Oval Office, meeting with Trump, doing deals with him, and sort of trying to take a more bipartisan approach versus someone like J.B. Pritzker, who the governor of Illinois, who is really aggressively trying to counter and sort of be the face of the resistance. And that doesn't exactly answer your question about who that next person is, but I think it shows that there is this real divide about like, how do you move forward? And I think there is a real hunger in the Democratic Party for new voices. There's a story today in the Times about this new group, Majority Democrats, about sort of some of these younger Democrats in Congress and in the states that are trying to push the party. And it's less about sort of ideology and more about age. They're sort of like, we need to move past this idea of sort of just having 80-year-olds run the party and speak more to a new generation. I think we saw that in New York City, right? Yeah. This sort of the election of Zoran and Andrew Cuomo has his own issues for a host of reasons, but I think that is, I think, emblematic of some of the energy we're seeing in the party. So it's hard to answer your question because if you think back to where we were, Obama at this time wasn't a national figure, and so I think we'll have to see like these midterm elections, which sort of candidates emerge, and go from there.
And I think we have time for one more question, but just to answer one add-on to his answer, I have been thinking a lot about, I think whoever emerges on both sides, one of the key things that Trump has displayed, it will have to be authenticity. Like if you look back at previous elections, almost always the candidate who feels more honest, more authentic. I can't tell you the number of anecdotes you would hear from aides of Hillary Clinton. Like, if you could just see her behind closed doors, like she's so funny, she's so warm, and like that very well may be true. But if you can't convey that to the general public, you're not going to win. Interestingly, McCain and Obama, in different ways, were both quite authentic. But Michael, my colleague here at The Atlantic, and I have been talking a lot about like how amusing it is to watch Democrats in this period try to learn how to like be real humans and speak like real humans to their fellow humans. And I think that's something both parties are going to have to do for whoever emerges. And your question.
Hi, I just have a quick question. I worked on the Harris campaign this past fall as a senior at Dartmouth College, and I think that one of the things I noticed that impacted like student vote a lot on campus was the Israel-Gaza issue, and like students and other people's view on the war. And I was wondering, in your guys' reporting, how you think that impacted what happened in the election.
You can talk about
I'll
that
start
tape.
and then I'll let Tyler. What do you want me to talk about? What's my order?
That tape of Trump at the fundraiser.
Oh yeah, one of the things we have in the book is at the fundraiser, or whatever, at a luxury hotel in New York. Trump's telling all of his donors, you get me in office, and I'll throw these protesters out of the country. Like, I know that's what you guys want, and we'll get them all out of here. And he sort of did that to some degree. I think that issue was huge. I was talking to Debbie Dingell, the congresswoman from Dearborn, Michigan, a couple of weeks before the election, and she said to me that Harris was in real trouble. She said, I see too many voters in Dearborn, too many people are coming up to me in the store, too many people. And Debbie Dingell is sort of a venerable congresswoman who goes back to her district almost every weekend, right? She's not one of these people who stays in Washington. She goes home. And she said, I can't believe how many people in my district are voting for Trump. And she said, I'm sitting here trying to tell them, he wants to throw you guys out of the country, this, that, and the other. And she says they're so angry over this issue. It's a protest vote, and they don't care. And she was right. In fact, after the election, the congresswoman told me that she thought the numbers were basically she saw how much he was going to win Dearborn in that area because she saw how angry people were about that. I'll let you sort of finish this, but I do know that the Trump folks, one of the scenes we have in the book is even during the primary, one of his top political aides were in New Hampshire, and he's talking about, James Blair is telling us about how that's an issue they're going to exploit the most. If Biden, is Biden and Harris and the Democrats, that's what they're going to exploit the most. And I think they did that sort of successfully in some places.
And just one thing I'd add on that, I think one of the interesting things too is a lot of campaigns are staffed by young people, and generally people weren't super inspired to work for Joe Biden, but that issue in particular made it even harder to get the sort of young organizers around the country to sign up and work for him because that just issue was so important to so many young people. And it's interesting, that was the one issue that Kamala Harris really had disagreements with Joe Biden on, and she wanted to try to figure out a way to break more from him on that. And she was much more critical of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But one of the things that she was sort of cautioned about by national security people in the White House was, we need a united front on this issue because we are trying to get American hostages out of Gaza. And if you break with the president publicly, we are worried that will make it harder for these negotiations. Is that true? Unclear, given Trump's success in getting some of the hostage home. But that was another thing that was weighing on her. And again, this came up at the Democratic Convention, where there was a lot of protests about wanting to put a speaker of Palestinian descent on stage. And there was, again, some pushback from the White House and the National Security Council, thinking that could be an impediment to some of the diplomatic efforts that were going on.
All right. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you, Ashley.